Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next webinar of Productivity and Profitability webinar series. This series is being brought to you by Meat and Livestock Australia and Agrista. The MLA Productivity and Profitability series is designed to assist sheep, cattle and goat producers to increase the productivity and profitability of their business. The series will provide timely technical information relevant to producers across Australia. My name is Ellie Hayes and I am a consultant with Agrista and I'll be your host for tonight's webinar. In this webinar, we are thrilled to have Ed Regal join us to discuss the integration of livestock into mixed farming. Before I hand over to Ed, though, I would like to cover off on some housekeeping of this webinar. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be available on the Agrista and MLA websites. We invite you to ask questions for Ed throughout the webinar and we will address them at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, please head over to slido.com and enter in the code hashtag DEC2024. So to gauge our audience tonight, I would like to start with a short introductory survey for you all to fill out. You can simply scan the QR code on the screen to access Slido if you haven't already logged in. I won't display all the questions on here, but I find this one is a good one to display on the screen to show everyone else who is online tonight. So I'll give you a few minutes to log in and do the intro survey. If you are just joining us, we're just doing an intro survey. So if you could scan the QR code and fill out the intro survey. How many on? We'll just wait a couple more minutes to finish the intro survey. If you've just joined us, we're just filling out this intro survey. So if you scan that QR code on the screen, and it'll take you straight to it. Here comes a few more people.
Geez, Ellie, I didn't think this was part of the deal, having people turning up.
Yeah. Yeah, slowly coming in. Surveys are slowly coming in too. We'll try get at least 3 more responses. Anyone can scan the QR code and answer the few questions. Righto, we might continue and then people can fill them in as they go. So for those of you that do not know Ed is the Director and Principal Consultant at Ag Pro Management, serving around 180 clients across Western Australia. With a background in consulting and hands-on farm experience, Ed established Ag Pro to support farmers in creating productive, sustainable and profitable farming systems. Ed's passion is in designing farming systems that are aligned, work easily and match the client's management capacity, be it for sheep systems or on the whole farm and how crop and sheep interact. His expertise span from business management, animal husbandry, budgeting, business analysis and strategic planning. Through Ag Pro, Ed helps clients align their farming practices with management capacities and environmental needs. He also hosts the Ag Pro Cast podcast discussing important topics in livestock and agriculture. So I'll hand over to you, Ed. I'll just stop sharing my screen. And let you.
And I'll start sharing. Ooh. Yeah, well, thanks very much. And I think that's really important. I'm going to go straight onto the slides because you don't want to see my ugly mug. I can get that up. Thanks. No, really. Is that on the full screen view there, Elle?
Yeah, I can see that. Thanks, Ed.
Is that the full screen?
Yeah.
Or just?
Yeah, so your first slide.
Yeah, great. I was just wondering how that looks. Yeah, and I think that's really important. I suppose as a consultant, it's those last points I think are really important when we're thinking about talking to clients, and it's something that I guess comes over time, but it's really important as a consultant to really try and embrace, to try and see where the client is at, where the producer is at in their life, what their goals are, what sort of person they are, what their financial situation. I mean, all the different aspects of it, because a lot of advice, you can give a cookie cutter approach to it, but there's so much more to it, and everyone's in a different situation. And tonight, I'm going to be talking about focusing on some nutrition as far as integration between crop and livestock, and that's probably the first spot where we have to stop, because when we're thinking about it, when we're talking about summer nutrition, I guess the first place to stop is there's a huge range of animals that we can be talking about. I mean, in a lot of the situation, a lot of the advice out there, and the lifetime U info and everything that we use, you sort of instantly are drawn towards a merino recommendation. But there's a huge range from shedders, doonies, maternals, and merinos. And within merinos, we have, traditional types and then dual purpose types. And obviously then we can go into looking at the weight of the sheep. So those things are all important. And then the type of farm you're on. If you're on 100% pasture operation, your recommendations are going to be different to that who's got 30% pasture or 50% pasture. Sorry, 30% crop, 50% crop, or even 70% crop. And those people who've transitioned through those spaces will know exactly what I mean, and how much it changes that those summer nutrition recommendations. And then we look at the type of environment that you're living in Australia. I'm talking from a whole country aspect, or from I suppose a farming area aspect, is that we have summer rainfall versus winter rainfall, and that's hard. These are hard things for you to get your head around if you're not in that environment. The difference between so the wheat belt of Western Australia and Armidale in two different rainfall environments, and then the type of manager you are, your capacity for detail, the scale of your business, how big it is, the time you have available to do things, because of those things, the stage in life you're at, the amount of kids you're at. I always have a bit of a laugh with clients, and where we talk about, especially they've got intricate businesses, and they've had 2 or 3 kids, and then suddenly, because I've got 3 kids of my own, and I said, well, you're not going to be able to work every weekend later on. You're going to have to be going to a lot of school things, and then school sports takes over, and that's just insane, the amount of school sport I do on weekends. So the time that you once had to run your farm and do these things will change. And then how much staff do you have, and those factors factor into the type of package. And I suppose what I'm setting this up for is that you're going to hear information tonight, and it mightn't be for you because of your system or your sheep or those things, but there's aspects that you can take from it, I guess. And I suppose a big part of this presentation, if we are looking to it from a nutrition and a summer nutrition package, is that I just want to, I suppose, acknowledge that there's been some pretty big areas of the farming area of Australia that's had a bit of a shocker during the year. Particularly if we look at South Australia, Western Victoria, and they didn't have a bad start, good, middle, average finish. They just had a bad start, bad middle, bad finish. So particularly with Western Australia, our spring last year was pretty crap. This year wasn't that good, but when we're starting to get into, I guess the point of this, as we're looking at it, when we're getting into summer and we've had a bit of a poor spring, we need to look at the start of, we need to look where we're going to finish. So the decisions that we make very early on are going to affect this decision about how my farm's going to look come, say, autumn, winter next year. If we have an average sort of break, an average break for us is around the 15th of May. So if we have an average sort of break, how are we going to look come that time next year? And what are the decisions we have to make to manage that? And the things that, I guess, the things that you come back to when things aren't that great and you're having to think about, is I always come back to the assets. And the assets are you, the people, the land that you're looking after, and then obviously the sheep. And predominantly, I guess, we're thinking about the ewes. I look at the ewes as the assets, and the lambs as the dividends that get sold from them. So we can make decisions there. But if we're going to go into next year with our assets in good conditions, what are the decisions we have to make early? And the first place to look at that, and this whole presentation isn't about having a bad season. There's a big variation out there, but I just thought I'd just like to touch on this, particularly for those people, is to do a farm audit. So what are my available stubbles like? What are the types of stubbles that I've got? If I'm big on wheat, we know they're not the greatest for sheep to utilise. However, barley is an excellent stubble. Generally, the sheep can do a lot better on barley. Do we have chaff piles? I don't know. Or if people are using those still, they're excellent for sheep versus destructors on the back of the harvesters. So, and when did we finish harvest? Have we started harvest? Have we started grazing them a month early? Because if we start grazing everything a month early, we're probably, and it's generally, if we have a poor spring, and I'll get into this, touch on this later, is that the quality is high. So you start grazing them a month early, high quality, guess what? They're going to eat them. So how's that going to look later on? Again, what's our pasture crop ratio as far as the amount of fodder we have for the summer that's on the farm, on the ground? And what's our potential for sales stock? I think it's really important to get out there and make a plan with your stock agent early. Get them over and make a plan. We had a pretty hard situation last summer over here where we had a lot of delayed sales. This is what I'm saying in the next line. So when we're trying to plan our summer stocking rate, we might be planning to sell 1,000 ewes, cull ewes on the 15th of December, but they weren't going to the 1st of February. And that really was hard hitting. But if you get in there early and make those plans and say, well, what if we can't? What's the situation if this happens? Which is what we did. What else do we have to sell? How can we manage this? Again, water, it's varied around Australia. The access to it, is it dams? Do you have bores? Do you have troughs? Do you have to set up troughing? In some situations, people have to set up tanks in paddocks, and cart water from stovepipes off the farm. And that's a real decision, because once you start, I suppose pending a thunderstorm in that situation, you don't stop. And that's a big job. So it's something you really need to commit to. What's your access? How much time do you have to do it? What's your desire to do this? Do you want to just sell stock early because you just don't have the energy, or you don't have the staff, etc.? And then obviously we move on to grain on hand, and we'll get into that in more detail. So what do you have on hand, and what types of grains do you have on hand, and what's your access to grain in the area you're living in, or hay or straw? What's the condition score of your ewes? That's a really big question, because as soon as you can access that decision, you can get in there and start condition scoring those sheep and put them and divide them up into in their types, which once you get onto that early and start managing their condition score early and managing their nutrition, then that's a lot cheaper. It's one of the free things you can do, apart from the time to do it, because you'll find they actually need less feed through doing it if you can maintain them early. Staffing, again, how much staff do you have or family on hand to actually do these jobs when you're increasing the amount of feeding that you're doing and the amount of water and those things? And, I suppose the question that probably should be at the top of this list is, how much cash have you got, or access to money? Because if you're going to have to buy more feed, etc., then you just need to know that situation. And I think that's a really important thing that you should really, obviously, when you go into these situations, if it's extremely tough, which it is for a lot of people, then you really need to be in that position. Just need to know what your position is. Sounds obvious, but believe me, a lot of people just bury their heads in their sand. And I'm sure everyone on the webinars heard of someone who said, well, once that runs out, that's it. I'm not feeding them anymore. And that's just got disaster written all over it. But it's not necessarily that situation. So just getting into summer feed, so there's a couple of things to think about. So if you have had a good season and it's a long growing season, that can impact on your feeding strategies, because the longer the growing season, the less digestible the dry matter is. So you'll have large amounts of dry matter, large amounts of stubble and dry matter. And it can be easy to get a bit of a false sense of security, because you're looking at all this feed, but you could also be looking at a large amount of cardboard that's out there. So it's just important to be aware of that, and examples are like big oat stubbles are a great example. I've seen sheep go backwards with, access to masses of oat stubble, but it's just been a massive season, long season, and it's just been very low in energy and especially protein, which we'll cover off. But there's other aspects to it as well. So there's with big stubbles often comes a lot of grain on the ground, and not to mention my favourite feed source, which is clover burr, and this continues to amaze me through my consulting career. When I've got in there and done, especially when I was starting doing it, I started to get our lifetime manuals out and go, these sheep need 500 grams of lupins and per head per day. And you get out in the paddock and there's just this dirty old clover paddock in February, which is not a lot in it. And the sheep are as fat as mud and they're getting fed 150 grams a day. And it's just, the more I looked into it and the more emphasis, it's a bit of a hidden benefit of I suppose, people look at cutting on fertilizer and those sort of facts sometimes, those sort of things with their pastures. But having good clover is not just about winter feed. There's a lot of clover burr, particularly in Western Australia, and if you've got heavy country, it's a really, it provides a much larger proportion of feed, I believe. Or I reckon. I'm not going to say believe because it's a cop out than people give it credit to. So, but sometimes you can be wrong, and that's where condition scoring is always important, especially if there's a good coat of wool on the sheep, unless you've got shedders, you can see them. And the reverse happens in a poor season. So highly digestible, like this year, classic spring this year. Really tight spring. The sheep looked amazing. The quality of the feed was amazing. And the same can roll on into summer as well, in that if it's a sharp cutoff, the sheep do really well on the dry feed. It's highly digestible. The sheep look great. But as it says, it tasted so good we ate it all. And you can end up, you might be looking at your summer stocking rate going, it's going to take me to day X, but it's all gone a bit earlier. And you then can be faced, particularly with those people who are having an earlier lambing, can be faced a big feed deficit between what they need and what's available. I think there's a lot more of a feed cliff in those summers where you're used to getting, say, it might be 6 or 7 megajoules or 5 or 6 megajoules out of the pasture every day, and suddenly you're going from that to 1 or 2, and they can really go downhill quickly. And as I said on the previous slides about the poor season, how's my farm going to be looking come Anzac Day for that decision-making process in those years? So we sort of talked about the farm and a bit of auditing. What are the requirements of a sheep? Now, if you're looking at a merino sheep, they're a very selective grazer. They tend to pick out the best parts of the pasture. They'll go through and they'll go back over and they'll take the next best parts of it, and then they'll go again and again and again, and they'll just keep selecting the best parts of it. The maternals less so, Adoonis less so, maternals less so, and shedders even less so. So that's just an aspect of the sheep. So 50 the merino, if I'm looking for merino, 50 kilo adult dry ewe requires 7 to 8 megajoules of energy. I've got a bit of a slide about that later on about energy levels. So, and 6 to 8% protein. And that 6 to 8% protein from a grain perspective is pretty much in every sort of grain, there'll be enough protein in it. So energy is king. I'm sure you've heard that from lots of people. The vitamins and minerals are far further down the list. If you don't have energy, energy first, protein second, and vitamins and minerals down the list. But if you don't have energy, then you can be really struggling. And that was a bit of a message last year. We did a few webinars and podcasts where people were totally there was no hay, there was no straw, there was no lupins. They could just get barley. And with a bit of buffer, it turned out the sheep could live on barley. And, you get backed into a corner and that's what we have to do. And the sheep did okay. Ideally, they would have been having something a bit more elaborate, but that was enough. And I think it's really important to remember that sometimes you just got to use what's available, and that's really important. For us in the West, when calcium's important when you're feeding high cereal diets, generally about a month after you start feeding cereals, it's recommended to go in with calcium in either on the grain or in a lick of some variety. A lot of people just mix lime and salt together and have a very, very cheap lick. And we'll get into vitamin E. Selenium's important as well, but we'll talk about vitamin E with weaners later. So sheep can eat 3% of their body weight if everything's going well. So they've got enough appropriate protein and energy for their requirements. But also, I think that's a really good point in that if they're faced with not enough protein, then they might be able to eat 3%, but they just won't be able to do it because the protein actually restricts that reduction in protein reduces the amount they're able to eat. So that might go down to 2% or 1.5% if those protein levels are really low in the paddocks. And that's when you're seeing a really, I suppose, low protein stubble or like a wheat stubble or pastures that are getting pretty long in the tooth, or you've had significant rainfalls over the top of them, which can also reduce the amount of protein in those stubbles and energy as well. So it's important. That's why we're blessed in Western Australia to have the magic lupins available to us, although we also are having a lot of faba beans available to us as well, which have very high in protein. So we can feed a small ration of that, which can also increase the ability for the sheep to digest stubbles and those lower protein rations that are out there. And as I said before, there's different requirements. So, I mean, as a rough guide, I'd say from a merino needing, say, 7 to 8 megajoules, I'd say a doonie needs 90% of that. Probably said this before, sorry from repeating myself. Maternals 75%, and maybe shedders around 50% of that requirement. So just be aware when you're hearing people or you're hearing a presentation, they're talking about numbers, to be aware of what you've got and the type of animals you've got and what their requirements are. And I've seen it firsthand. I had a client who did have doonies and has gone back to merinos and bought a line of merino ewes in, and he said, Ed, there's something wrong with these sheep. They're just going backwards at the rate of knots. And I just told him to increase the lupins by 100 grams a day, and bingo, 2 weeks later, he thought I was a hero. He said, it's amazing, because the sheep were just instantly doing better. Their requirements were just higher. Because that wool factor is pretty powerful in how much they need as well. So let's get into it. So different grains have different energy and protein contents. Oats tend to be the ones that have the biggest range of energy. So they have a range between 8 to 11.5 megajoules of energy and 5.5 to 13 percent protein. So depending on the season, they can have a real range and variety. There can be a real range. So I haven't got a slide up here, but if you do have a big component of oats in your ration that you're feeding, it's probably good to get a feed test done. Feed test in Geelong do a pretty good job, and we use them for our trial work. And so that's just off the cuff there. But there's probably a heap of them around as well. So it's probably good to get oats if I had a big ration of oats. Lupin's pretty consistent at 13 to 14 megajoules and 27 to 35% protein. So that high protein level, really, that's what I love about them. The sheep love them, and just that ability to feed a really low ration of them to sort of give that protein content. I mean, you could almost look at them as they're a supplement beyond energy as well. And then, the higher in energy as well. Barley, well, it's interesting, 11.5 to 12 I've got there, but last year we had some coming in at 13 to 14 megajoules on a pretty short season. Like, it was incredible, the quality of the barley. And again, fairly reasonable variation. So there is new genetics coming through with these. So it might be worthwhile getting those feed tested as well. I probably wouldn't worry with the lupins, but yeah, particularly if you have a big ration that you're feeding, it's just good to know what you're doing. I mean, there is an element that I think that's a good thing to do. Okay, so getting down to stubbles. This is a rough guide from the credit to the Lifetime U magazine. That wondering how much grain's in the paddock. So if you've got a quadrant, like a 30 by 30, whatever, or put your feet akimbo, you can make a square. And if there's roughly 28 grains in there of wheat or oats, that's roughly 100 kilos per hectare. Barley, it's 25, and lupins, probably the same for beans, around about 8 is equivalent to 100 kilos per hectare. So it gives you a rough idea of how much is out there, and then you can work your way back to how much grain's available for the sheep. Thinking about them eating, might be 2.5% of their body weight to 3, and roughly how much they're going to eat a day and how much access they've got. If it gets down, particularly with the barley and the wheat and oats, if it gets down to single figures with those, they're probably burning as much energy eating the grain as they are as the grains there. So it's just a rough rule of thumb. So yeah, in summer, obviously weaners are a big issue. Well, it's for us that early summer is the real challenge when the pastures start to turn. I think, and I'm sorry to bang on about lupins again, lupins and beans, but they can solve a lot of problems in this area. So when the pasture starts to turn, we know that the energy levels are still pretty good, but the protein level starts to drop. And that's the old leaky bucket syndrome, that if they're not getting enough protein, then they just won't be able to eat enough energy. And for weaners, it's a lot higher. It's looking around 15%, whereas adults, we said before, it was 6 to 7%. So for us, particularly having a higher protein ration is really important, particularly if we generally have reasonably short seasons over here. September can be finished in September for some people, September, October. So those June, July lambs, a lot of those lambs can be pretty small when they're transitioning from the green phase to the dry phase. And we know that under 25 kilos, that they really need to be growing, otherwise they're going backwards, and backwards means they're dying. So that's really important. Obviously, and it's just a compounding factor. If the lambs are in good condition, I mean, obviously we need to look after them for worms, but everything handles everything a bit better when it's in better condition. So, but doing that worm management is important, and I'm not going to go over that. That's variable from state to state to how much green pick you've got and everything. From a local perspective, I'm a big fan of long-acting injectable drenches, and I'm in the winter for our ewes, and trying to allow that to continue, to avoid resistance for that. I'm not really interested in using moxidectins at any other time of the year, and important. That's just a bit of a side pick on that. So I tend to avoid moxies for weaners because we're trying to use it for use that another time of the year. But obviously we're doing a lot of worm resistance tests and those sorts of things. Vitamin E every 6 weeks post green pick. So like last year, there was no rain from September last year. So there was no green pick at all. So, but it's pretty easy, and you can stick it on grain. So it's a pretty easy thing to apply to, or if you're drenching your sheep, and you can add it in with your drench as well. So it's just a no-brainer. That they need that around about every 6 weeks, and the smaller they are, the more vulnerable they'll be to that as well, from the point when the season finishes. Selenium for us over here, it's important at to a point within the wheat belt. And as I said, 25 kilos going to summer. If they're not growing, then they're dying. And that's just and I think particularly in the last year or couple of years, where we've really needed to have a really good quality merino weather to be able to sell it. People have grasped that and have started any feedback. Anyone who started feeding that low rate of lupins early or low rate of feed at 50 to 100 grams early at the transition of the season, their sheep have all gone earlier and they've had just a huge amount of success from doing that. And it's just something you've got to do with our shorter seasons. So summer nutrition, yes. Feeding cereals, it's got to be every 2 to 3 days at a minimum. I'm sure there's some people out there who probably ride the lightning a bit more, but just from a starch and an acidosis aspect, that's the way I look at it. You probably could push it out if you're feeding using an acid buff product with it. I guess that's the great thing about lupins, again, is that you can, there's some pretty good trial work that's been done over the years. You can feed them once a week if you really need to. It's not ideal, but if you're flat out, and you'll notice that, I suppose, some of my advice, it's not the ideal advice, but in a lot of situations when you're mixed farming, you've got cropping, you're trying to get a crop off, you're trying to, as I said before, you might be trying to do I'd rather you feed lupins once a week than not at all. So don't let perfect be the enemy of good, is my message there. So, but with cereals, 2 to 3 days, but you could go in with a buffer, but yeah, I'd stick to that. These are the key tips to feeding. Just take the tail off as soon as you can. It's incredible. You take the tail off, feed them separately of the mob off, and feed them separately, and don't have to feed them a greater rate, but you'll find they'll just pick up. There's a lot of bullying that goes on between mobs of sheep, and it's incredible what happens when you break that up. And that's free, not having to feed anymore. Lower rates for longer. I'm a big advocate of starting at lower rates earlier rather than waiting to the right point in the year to start feeding a higher ration, because we know if we can maintain that condition score rather than letting it drop and pick up, we can feed them, we can save money, you don't have to feed as much feed. So that's just a no-brainer. Again, starting 2 weeks early, finishing 2 weeks later. When you think it's time to start feeding, you're probably about 2 weeks late. And again, at the end, when I get a phone call, should I stop feeding? I just tend to go for at least another week longer, depending how close you are to, the scenario you're in. But you'll find that it's probably another 50 or 60, could be another 50 or 60 cents per head that you're saving, but the impact of not feeding it could be pretty huge. Condition score, the earlier condition score, and or evaluate your sheep. Look, I've been consultant for 20 years, and we've been talking about condition scoring for that long, and I know a lot of people don't do it. I know a lot of people do it at 80 k's an hour. But there's nothing quite like, I think the biggest success with condition scoring probably has been doing it while they're in the yard. So you're drenching or shearing, or just get your hands on them, and you can make some decisions there, because the sooner you make that decision, the sooner you stop them from going backwards, the more money you'll save with hand feeding. The sooner you can evaluate those sheep and get them off. I mean, just getting, I suppose that's very much in line with taking the tail off the mob. I really think this is a really big thing to think about, which is supplementary feeding versus substitutional feeding. And I guess that's the greatest example of that. Might sound a bit silly, but feeding hay on stubbles or feeding hay in really grassy pastures, far better off. That might be all you've got because you've got all your product on your farm. But supplement what you've got there. Supplement the type of feed you've got on your farm, so you can value add to it. So, if you've got a stubble, that's what I'm saying. If you've got lots of stubbles, then those high protein rations are really good because they help them utilize those pastures. I suppose that's the key one. And then obviously when you don't have, you can save that hay and straw up for when there's bugger all dry matter left. So, and I just put this down before, when you do have summer storms, there is pretty good value in that regrowth. Just got to get it before the spray rig comes and blows it all out. So, and just being, I suppose, aware of how that affects the sheep as far as dags and those sort of factors as well. And a little bit of regrowth, absolutely. You from a vitamin E factor, it's just huge. And vitamin E is great for all sheep. It's very hard to replace, a few mouthfuls of feed with the powders and the stuff you stick on their feed. It'll do an okay job, but as far as helping them with antioxidants and those sort of things, the green pixamate goes a long way. So I'm hoping you can see this slide. I'm sorry, it's a bit smaller, but it's just talking about what's grain worth to your sheep. Now I'm just going to talk through this slide. I'll go through each column. So down the left-hand side, we've got the different varieties. So lupins, oats, wheat, barley, pellets, and hay. And then we've got the value of that grain. So the lupins are $4.40 a tonne. Oats currently, lupins are probably $500 a tonne. Oats $4.40. So we'll just think about the scenario I've got here. Wheat $3.50, barley $3.40, pellets $4.40, hay $300. And then we've got the megajoules of energy in the next column. And then we've got the dry matter in the next column. Now, I'm supposed to change this, but if you're feeding out on the ground, then I've put lupins, instead of 92% dry matter, I've actually put them at 110% dry matter, because the utilization of lupins when feeding on the ground is excellent. They really clean them up to the degree where we quite often have used lupin crops as standing fodder crops, because they will utilize all the lupins in the paddocks. Well, the lambs might, and then the ewes will come through and finish them off. So high utilization. And then we break that back down to the cents per megajoule. And we can see the lupins are 2.96, the oats are 4.47, wheat 3.17, barley 3 cents an 8, pellets 4 cents 0.78, and hay 3.53. Now I've just got it's a pretty high rate. It's just a rounded ration, really. So 10 megajoules, which is pretty high. But I suppose if you're getting into getting a bit deeper into the pregnancy cycle, that's something you could be feeding. And so just breaking that down. So I've got a cost per head, a cost per week, and then a cost per week per 1,000 sheep. So if I look at that, because my eyes are crap, I think we're looking at 2,074, 3,124, 2,000. So you can just see the spread there. So I've actually got this, it's just a very simple spreadsheet, and I'm very happy to, if anyone wants to email me, I'm sure Ellie will give you the email and I'll send this through to you, and you can plug your own figures in. And it's just a really easy way of evaluating what you're feeding. And there's other reasons why you might be feeding what you're feeding, but it's a good way of doing a quick calculation. Especially if you're buying pellets, because they can be quite popular. But sometimes I'm not sure if they're the right feed, particularly if you're feeding out in the paddock. There's reasons for it, particularly with mixed farming for weeds and those sort of factors. But as people say, they've got everything in them, but have you got everything you need on your farm? Maybe you should be evaluating your what you've got with other grains or hay. So just in summary, think about, when you're thinking about summer feeding, let's think about the long season and the poor season and the different aspects of that. Weaners, they need a high protein diet at 14% prior. That's the limitation, and that's what they need. And it's really important to cost your ME rather than just what the value of the grain is per tonne. So, and I'd just like to finish. I like this slide, and I'm really quite passionate about it. And I think it gets more important. The bigger you get, the more complex your business gets. Sometimes you've just got to get the job done. So, you can have continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection. And I think that's what, I think a lot of us, I can be guilty of that in aspects of my life. And I think, I think particularly when you're coming to livestock, you can see that with that happening sometimes. I'm waiting for this before I do that because it's not quite right. So sometimes you just got to get the job done. So thanks very much, Ellie.
Thanks, Ed. Apologies. I couldn't find my mouse there for a second. I'll just share my screen as well. Back to... Thanks, Ed, for the insights into integration of livestock into mixed farming. I do have a couple of questions for you. One is, how does wool production affect the nutritional requirements?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I didn't cover that, and some really good data at the lifetime lifetime wool data was that if you let your condition score in the first half of lambing of gestation, if you let their conditions score drop half a condition score, that can be the equivalent to 400 grams of clean wool. So at the moment, that's not as much as it was a couple of years ago, but there's still probably 10 kilos of grain there. So it's not going necessarily into a black hole. Yeah, I think that's really important, and that's the same happens at the back end of lambing as of conception of gestation as well. In that, if you let them fall, if you build them up and they drop down again, then you can it's another equivalent to the same sort of thing. So they can, in total, there could be up to $10 or worth of feed equivalent to maintaining them. So, and that's just from a wool aspect. It's just something probably to think about when you're. Sorry, I'm very dark here. When you're feeding them, might make you feel better.
Thanks, Ed. I have one just to do with grazing crops. So I always find that you get producers that either favour the livestock or they favour the crops. How do you effectively manage both to optimise your crops, but then also your animal production?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. There's a bit of new data coming out about grazing crops and the timeline available for it. I think my comment on that is, with the cost of inputs into cropping at the moment, just to budget the other day, I was talking to a guy and it was going to be 550. This is 300 mil rainfall. It's going to be 550 in chemicals and fertilizer before they even got into doing anything. That's just raw product. So, and the cost of machinery to do it and all those sort of factors is you really want to get a good result out of it. So you really just want to nail it, make sure your weeds. But, things have also changed in that we've got access to a lot more chemicals. Like historically, like the weed issue was really bad, really big issue. So I guess you want to be doing it right is my message. So you want to have the paddock set up right and you want to be doing it right. But there is an aspect to that of, if you're doing it right and you're doing the grazing right, it is, once you've maximised your inputs for your pastures and the type of pastures you're running, that is the only place that you're going to get another couple of DSE, which is what we're talking about as far as making more money out of your pastures, is how can I optimize my stocking rate? And probably you're going to get a bit of that out of your grazing crop. And, the varieties available now and the yield that are coming out of them are fantastic. So there's a lot of options out there.
Awesome, thank you. And with Christmas coming up, Prue does have one question for you. Do you have any tips for Christmas gifts?
Just buy your wife some perfume. Just do that. Close your eyes, write the check.
I'll pass
Give
it
your
on
sheep.
to.
Go and
I might
buy.
pass
Go
that
and
on
buy.
to John.
Go and buy a road train of lupins for your sheep. There you go.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you everyone who joined us tonight. Ed, thank you for sharing some great information about integration of livestock into mixed farming. If you have any additional questions, sorry, Ed, you go.
Just one last thing is, it's very hard to do everything right. I think it's just really important. And it's important to give yourself a break. And it's important to set up, when you're looking at your business, just look at all the aspects you've got to it. You know, if you've got sheep, you've got crop, you've got hay, you've got kids at school, you've got all this stuff happening. You know, you've really got to try and simplify each aspect of your business. Otherwise, it's going to be really, really challenging.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Ed. If you have any additional questions or suggestions for future webinars topics, please reach out by completing the survey at the QR code that's on the screen. This feedback helps us guide future webinars. If you're listening to the recording, please also complete this survey. Thank you again for attending, and thank you so much, Ed, on this topic. And we are looking forward to having our next webinar where we will be talking about ram selection and breeding suggestions with Tim Gould.
Yeah.
I do wish everyone.
Tune in.
Yeah. Yes. I do wish everyone a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year if I don't see you before the end. And if you have missed last month's webinar, head over to MLA or the Agrista website to watch it. And awesome. Happy listening, everyone.